would you like to improve your health and keep your family safe? You're listening to the Healthy Home Hacks Podcast, where we firmly believe enjoying optimal health shouldn't be a luxury. Healthy Home Authorities and husband and wife team Ron and Lisa will help you create a home environment that will level up your health. It's time to hear from the experts. Listen in on honest conversations and gain the best tips and advice. If you're ready to dive in and improve your well-being and increase your energy, you're in the right place. All right, here are your hosts, bowel biologists, authors, media darlings, vicarious vegans, and avocado aficionados, Ron and Lisa Barris.
Today's episode of Healthy Home Hacks is brought to you by Suzanne Adams, Inc. For the woman that has a story to tell, she knows her path, her pain, her love, her intuition, and her own unique magic can and will serve the world in powerful ways. This woman is you. You don't do anything halfway, aren't excited to go all in this year and speak your soul on stages, both big and small. Suzanne's TEDx talk has now reached over 3 million people. She spent the last 9 years mastering the art of speaking her soul and spreading positivity and inspiration far and wide. And she's on a mission to help those that are ready to do the same, because you have a story to tell. Join Suzanne Adams for a transformational 4-day Speak Your Soul Masterclass designed to catapult you into the confidence and clarity you need to rock the stage, both in person and online. If you're desiring to share your soul in a more powerful way through speaking live or virtually, hosting workshops, your own or at corporations, then this is the perfect opportunity and conversation for you. Together, you'll dive into how to perfectly craft your story to magnetize any audience, how to attract more abundance and speaking opportunities, plus how to eliminate the fears that are holding you back on stage. Facebook and IG count as stages too. Head to the show notes right now for the link to sign up. This is the year for your story to be heard.
Let's face it, most of us enjoy daily routine and order. You know, when I wake up in the morning, I brush my teeth, I wash my face first, put on my contacts, get some coffee, take that coffee, sit in a chair right in front of the fireplace, meditate, kind of focus on my day and what I want to create. But you know what happens when your desire for routine and order has reached an unhealthy level? Well, according to the CDC, over 250,000 of adults in the US have symptoms of an anxiety disorder.
And for some people, they feel anxious when something isn't done perfect. As a Virgo, I can relate. Or maybe they find themselves fighting irrational or unwanted urges to repeat tasks. These are symptoms of OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder, a chronic anxiety disorder where a person experiences unreasonable, uncontrollable, or reoccurring thoughts followed by a behavioral response that causes anxiety. Today, OCD affects 1 in 40 adults and 1 in 100 children in the US.
The average age of onset of OCD is 19 and a half years old, and males make up the majority of the very early onset cases, almost a quarter of males before the age of 10. In fact, the majority of adults who had OCD at some point in their lives also had at least one other mental disorder. 75% of sufferers experienced anxiety disorders, including panic disorder, phobias, and PTSD.
Someone who can relate is our guest today. He personally struggled with OCD and anxiety during his late teens and early 20s. Matt Cotty is a licensed clinical social worker. And through his journey to recovery, Matt has developed a versatile and unique approach to OCD and anxiety recovery by combining personal experience with evidence-based practices. He is currently the host of the OCD and Anxiety podcast, the director of the online platform Restore Minds, and author of From Stuck to Unstuck, newly released on Amazon.
Welcome to the show, Matt.
Woohoo!
Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Oh, we're so excited. Welcome. And we are so happy we met you for the first time and realized this is such an important topic there's not anybody listening who hasn't experienced some level of anxiety. And I'm sure a lot of people who have OCD or know somebody who does. And so as we talked at the top of the show, we're going to get through how this is affecting so many people. And we're going to leave you guys with some really helpful tips and solutions. You're not left more stressed than when you got on the podcast.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
So Matt, before you joined us today, I had a flashback of my childhood of carefully walking on only certain colored tiles of my mom's kitchen just to make sure I didn't cross different ones because that might have been bad luck or whatever it might be, or skipping over them. And finally, after a while of doing that, realized, hey, why am I doing this? So Matt, please help us today.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you are skipping cracks when you're walking,
Right.
washing your hands too much, and Matt's going to get into all the symptoms. But Matt, can you explain to our listeners why you chose to work specifically with people who struggle with OCD and anxiety?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And, it's funny because like we talk about, all of us have some relationship with fear and anxiety, right? It's part of having a nervous system and being human. And it's rooted in our very survival when you really think about it. What happens, specifically why I started working with people with OCD and anxiety, was because I was struggling myself, like we talked about a little bit earlier. My first kind of experience was as early as about 10, like you were introducing in the show. I definitely encountered this early in life. And then it really got bad right when I was a freshman in college. Obviously, I knew it was a problem because I knew like everyone else that was at school wasn't experiencing what I was experiencing. There's a lot of misconception about what OCD is because a lot of what we see is the compulsion or the behavior. And really, when you understand OCD and anxiety, and how I try to conceptualize it for people, is it really is a loop that we get stuck in that's driven by fear. So for instance, like what my experience was kind of just being bombarded with like invasive and intrusive thoughts. And my behaviors would be things like ruminating about it or analyzing it or trying to block thoughts or stop thoughts or do things to make sure I didn't think things. And so the typical case that most people, identify as hand washing, right? Like Jack Nicholson in As Good as It Gets, if you guys are familiar with that movie. And what's interesting is like you see these odd behaviors, but what we often don't see is what's really driving that. And so what's going on is the person is first experiencing some kind of thought. For instance, like what if I step on this particular tile, like you just use your example, and something bad happens. So then they feel anxious. So they feel fear and they avoid stepping on the tile, and then nothing bad happens. And they put together this idea, well, because I didn't step on the tile, nothing bad happens. So I need to keep doing that.
Oh, I see.
So same concept of someone who touches a doorknob. Well, what if I get this terrible disease? And they wash their hands. Well, their brain's connecting this idea of saying, well, because we wash our hands and then we didn't get sick, there must have actually been a terrible disease and I kept myself safe. So it's this loop of danger and safety that the person gets essentially caught in. And this can manifest in all sorts of ways. And it's not just applicable to what we would call like the OCD spectrum of disorders, but also for basic anxiety disorders. Like the same person who has, let's say, what we would call social anxiety, they might say, well, I don't want to go to the mall because what if people laugh at me? So they avoid going to the mall and keep themselves in their house. And so they don't feel, so because they didn't get laughed at, they're like, oh, well, I stayed safe by staying inside. When really the big thing that we're really looking at here is, and this is what happened with me, is that the more you feed fear in life, the smaller your life becomes.
That's powerful. Say that again.
So the more you feed fear, right, by engaging in behaviors that reinforce it, the smaller your life becomes. And I obviously know this very much firsthand because my life got incredibly small in a very short period of time. And I didn't know what I was experiencing, right? I just knew, well, I have all these thoughts just flood my mind all day. I feel anxious and I'm having to do all this stuff just to kind of like get through the day. So as that happens, you don't socialize, right? You tend to isolate. It's hard to pay attention in school, as you can imagine. So I wasn't doing well in school. Nothing was going well.
So yours was internal, like someone looking at you wouldn't think, oh, he's suffering from. Yeah.
Well, and that's something I was really good at. And a lot of people are really good at is I was really good at putting on a face.
Okay.
Which actually is part of the problem too, because like when something's physically wrong, like you break your leg, people understand like, oh, here you have a broken leg. But like when something's off on a nervous system level, people can't pick that up usually unless you've experienced it yourself. So they assume everything's fine. And if you talk and say everything's fine, they don't really know any different, even though internally you're suffering.
Interesting.
So Matt, did you have social anxiety? So were you scared to go in public?
So when I look at anxiety, right, I see it as a spectrum of an experience. Like when I work with anyone, and I talk about this in From Stuck to Unstuck, is I think one of the problems that we have is we try to categorize these experiences and separate them, right? When really stress is our resistance to something. And general anxiety, social anxiety, phobias, OCD, panic attacks, even PTSD and things like derealization on the very, very high end of the stress spectrum or the anxiety spectrum function the same thing. They're all the same nervous system going into that fight or flight. Now, the experience for the individual is going to be different. So you might get a little anxious before a date, because you're like, well, what if this date goes bad? What if I say something stupid? Whatever. But the same kind of thinking just intensifies into the different levels, if you will. So it's almost like I kind of use like a scale, and it's like general anxiety is over here. And let's say like derealization or PTSD is over on the other end over here.
Like autism spectrum.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. It's a spectrum of an experience. And when you begin to understand that, what you really begin to understand, and this is like with my journey, okay, I'm actually not trying to solve the feeling of anxiety, because that's not what the problem is. So most people, and this is where just the language we use, I think, goes wrong collectively, is we say anxiety disorder. And that wording right there is really indicating that anxiety itself is a disorder for a lot of people.
It's
so they think like,
oh, okay,
because I experience anxiety, I have a disorder. When really how I try to explain it to people is like, no, when you get caught in the loop by engaging in behaviors that reinforce fear, it's the loop itself that creates disorder in your life.
They have a loop disorder, Matt. They have a loop disorder.
Or even the loop is, creating disorder, right? And so as we fix the loop, the disorder in your life tends to resolve. And the good news is because the loop requires your behaviors and needs those compulsions or safety behaviors, if we are able to remove those, that loop can't form. And really, that's the entire concept of the primary interventions that are used to really help people that are suffering with this or struggling with this. And it's really about recontextualizing the problem and working at it from a higher level. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. And like Ron, when you were trying to skip the cracks in the tile, had you continued to do that, it obviously would have got full blown, right? But you stopped it.
It is funny. I do recall as a young child doing that in different areas too, like at the playground or on the sidewalk, and then just telling myself, okay, well, I'm not going to do this anymore. So I kind of talked myself out of it. But then I just realized, Matt, you mentioned hand washing and touching doorknobs. And I'm starting to think that I went from cracks in sidewalks to doorknobs in bathrooms.
No, I think you went from cracks to locking doors.
Locking doors and washing door handles. Yeah. There you go.
And it's funny. What's so funny is like, or not funny, I shouldn't say, but what's so interesting to me as someone who, has the opportunity now to communicate with people in various countries is people that reach out. It's almost like the fears tend to manifest the exact same ways, even like cross-culturally and cross like language barrier, which is always so interesting to me because essentially what's happening, and this is really how I try to help people understand it, is like fear is something that we experience internally. And when we don't confront fear internally, what we do is we project it onto things in our environment. So we see it as something outside of us, right? And so a lot of people will be like, well, Matt, that doorknob causes me anxiety. And I'd be like, well, if that was true, then if I touch it, then it should cause me anxiety. It should be a true like X causes Y. But because it doesn't cause me anxiety, what we understand is that when someone gets triggered by something, it's actually fear coming up within their system.
Unresolved fear that they already have.
That they're storing in the system because it doesn't happen for everyone. And that happens through their belief patterns and conditioning and on all of that stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. If you're a person that does a lot of like spiritual work on yourself, clearing and, healing, you're going to be less likely, I'm guessing, to even have this ever become a problem.
Well, and again, just like anything, right? It's what causes the nervous system to really contract and to be like overstimulated is a bunch of stored emotion. And essentially that's what we do is when we think an emotion's inappropriate to feel or, I don't feel safe feeling a certain emotion, we suppress and repress. So what a lot of how the work of this recovery process is, yes, first we want to break the loop, but then we also want to teach people how to handle, like what I generally call it is the energy that comes up, because emotion is just energy and motion, and fear is just an energy level that we can experience as humans. So when you really get good at feeling the energy itself and not resisting it, that is really what allows people to really regulate their nervous system. And that's really what we're going for there. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I imagine that you've been very popular the last couple of years since COVID, because that was like fear on steroids.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember putting out an episode like April 2020, because I remember watching people fight over toilet paper at the store. And I remember seeing it like, okay, there's a serious fear issue here, because when you're overtaken by fear, and this is the thing, when you are not conscious of what energy you're in, you will behave and convince yourself you're being logical, right? Because it might seem, for someone who's like, well, that doorknob could be contaminated, it may seem logical to wash. But when that leads to people, again, washing for 3 hours in their day under like boiling hot water to the point where their hands get blistery, it's like, it becomes obviously where they're harming themselves. Like there's nothing logical about that, right? Paradoxically, their skin starts to crack and makes them more susceptible.
Yeah, they're making things worse.
Right? Yeah. And that's generally what happens when we aren't conscious of like the energy that we're operating from.
That's so powerful. I mean, that really is, because we talk a lot on this show about energy, and just everything's energy, right? Healing is energy. And, when I think back to those visuals and those memes you see on Facebook now, the people when going into the grocery store with like hazmat clear, remember they'd have like clear hazmat suits on and stuff, you're like, really? I mean, if you're that fearful, if you think the world is that scary and that bad, like, why are you even striving so hard to like protect yourself? Like, it's just crazy.
You said it so well, right? When you're that fearful, meaning it, or you're that full of the energy of fear, and realizing that that's actually like within. And instead of confronting the fear, we project it outside of us and try to control our environment.
Yeah. So I guess you saw during COVID, I mean, even the people driving around by themselves wearing masks in their car, they're still doing it.
We still see
you
it.
still
Right.
see it. I mean, so you really saw people's truth of their fears come up during that, on a worldwide scale. So that was kind of shocking.
Because again, a lot of people, we saw the spirit of fear really just kind of take over. You know what I mean? And we saw it being put out from a media standpoint. We saw it being put out like, you guys probably saw like, hey, you're not allowed to come here unless you have a certain card, or, we saw people fight. We saw violence erupt, and it came from fear. And this is why, like, I remember making the episode, I was like, hey, look, like the real pandemic we have is fear. We're experiencing and we're unaware of it.
Yeah, most people. Yeah.
And that's why when I look at, that stuck to unstuck, right? The whole point of that is really getting someone to recontextualize the problem as opposed to what their mind is telling them the problem is, and seeing it as a problem of like this energy of fear that you get stuck in.
Yeah. And, it makes me think about like, all these whispers of this next pandemic and this. Do you think the majority of the people that acted like so extreme are going to go right back into that place? Or do you think they're looking back and going, okay, maybe I took it too far and now I've learned from that? Or do you think if the fear is still there?
That's a great question. And I think it's just a matter of consciousness, right? And this is obviously a big thing that I talk about with clients and anyone that I work with, is consciousness is so important, because consciousness, our ability to at least be aware of our emotions and thoughts instead of identifying with them, right? So then on top of that, being aware of what we're experiencing and what we're doing and why we're doing it. For a lot of people, especially something like the energy of fear, which is very magnetic and very powerful. We can't deny that. And we've all been, I think, at some point encapsulated by fear and driven by fear, whether we knew it or not. And I think it was an amazing learning, because like, I know a lot of people who did things one way or another, maybe cut relationships with people because of their vaccination status or non-vaccination status, right? They could have, just cut people from their life. And this happens politically too, right? People will cut people for all sorts of reasons.
Because that person doesn't think like you, which is very ego, right? That's just your ego. Your ego wants someone to be like you.
Exactly.
And so judging someone for their decision because it's not like you has nothing to do with that person. It has everything to do with you.
Yeah. And what does that do? It makes you challenge yourself and say, am I always right? And the ego hates to be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. And I sincerely hope. And I mean, obviously, like, I'm not going to say that by any means that I handled things perfectly in any aspect of my life, because it was always, I think we were all going through a time where there was so much uncertainty and fear. Now, when I was working through that particular period of my life, and I got COVID like 3 times, right? And so we made a conscious decision of how because we had just had a baby, and the messages that we were sending to her of like, what's this world really like? Is this a dangerous world? And so that was a big way that we operated in our household. And I think it comes back down to the individual, just like healing on any level, as you guys probably know and believe. The only person that can ever really heal themselves is the individual. And healing comes from within. And a lot of, like you said, and it's really cool to hear you say that, because, healing is oftentimes about getting yourself on a certain energetic state, right? Like the healing, when you understand like the scale of emotions, or if you understand like David Hawkins' work or Frederick Dodson.
Chart of consciousness.
Yes. The mass consciousness. Yeah. And so fear is very low, right? And fear is a very low, you're operating
low vibrational frequency.
Sympathetic nervous system, where you move into states of acceptance, of love, of joy. You have access to so much more energy in your body.
Yes, that's right.
And that's why what the real paradox of, and I heard someone use this analogy one time and I just loved it, is with fear, what a lot of people, they're so afraid of feeling these lower emotions that it's like they're holding on to this ledge because they're worried that if they let go and feel them, that they're going to fall into the pits of hell. And the paradox is when you actually learn how to feel them and let go, you actually rise up and you raise out of it. And what the paradox is so many people are afraid of feeling these emotions like fear, that they hold themselves in it, as opposed to by feeling it, you actually rise up out of it.
And let it move through you, right? Yeah.
Sure. And let your body release it and process it like it knows how to do. And even from a very primal animal standpoint, I mean, we know animals know how to do this. Like if an animal is running away from a threat and it gets to a safe of freedom, a place of safety, it will shake, right? And the animal will shake and shake and shake. And what it's doing is discharging that excess energy in the body. So our bodies know how to do this.
Right. We were raised, a lot of us, to, men not cry. Men, don't be sad, be tough. Yeah.
Or, and not just fear, right? But it's not appropriate to be angry. It's not appropriate to feel these emotions. And that is actually, those beliefs are what cause us to suppress in the first place.
Yeah. I was an actress when I first moved to California. I was taking acting classes in LA, and I had to have this really angry scene. And I thought it was like shouting and screaming like I was supposed to be. And my teacher's like, Elisa, I bet you think you're like a 10 right now. And I said, oh, yeah. And he's like, no, you're like a 2. Like I had such a hard time, even in an acting class, getting to that state, because I was raised not to be like that, and be the good little girl and not get angry.
Yeah. And from a nervous system standpoint, right? So if you just think about it very big picture, so our 2 primal needs as people are authenticity and attachment to our caregivers. And this is from Dr. Gabor Mate's work in When the Body Says No, and he talks about the stress disease correlation. And so if we ever believe that being authentic will threaten our attachment, we'll suppress authenticity for attachment. So we learn that suppression of emotion is actually a survival instinct early on in life, because we need attachment for so many years as humans.
That's like,
and if we know like angry gets mom mad at me, okay, I need to not be angry.
Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Same thing with anything. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a friend who, she's in the spiritual community, and she had 2 daughters, and they had a meditation room in the house, just turned one of the rooms into a meditation room. And when the daughters had a meltdown or anything, sisters were fighting, she'd say, go to the meditation room and just think about what is making you so upset. And then when you're ready, come out and we'll discuss it. And like, her daughters are just like great girls and really well-rounded. I'm like, oh my God, you have to be kidding me. Every house should have a meditation room, like, or a closet, anything.
Or the simple message that you're allowed to feel how you feel.
Yeah, that it's okay. Right?
Like that feeling, that spectrum of emotion that we all are going to experience, that whole thing, maybe even in the same day. And that willingness to say, I'm not a bad person for this feeling. This feeling isn't me. It's something that I'm experiencing. And this is why, like,
be okay with it.
Yeah. And by doing that, though, that actually is what allows it to release, as opposed to holding it in our body. Right. This is why we talk about the concept of letting go. Right. What does that mean? Well, it means we're holding on to something to begin with.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, sometimes you'll hear about a couple, and then all of a sudden you hear this couple gets divorced, and you're like, wait, gosh, they never fought. You never heard. Yeah, because they were probably suppressing a lot of stuff, and all these issues were building up, and they realized it wasn't working, but they never like expressed it, so you do hear those stories.
Not to like, but I mean, that book by Gabor Mate, like When the Body Says No, is just such a fascinating read. And I think he just does a great job explaining how those kind of concepts, like you're saying, lead to long-term problems.
Yeah, this is really important. And it's interesting because this topic, doesn't fall under a healthy home hack, but it does, because a healthy home is a home.
Healthy living.
You need healthy people to have a healthy home, right?
Right. That's right.
Yeah, it's the spiritual side of like the physical. You need the mental, spiritual, mind, body, spirit, right? All of those have to be working together. And so, yeah, this is like a really good.
Well, and something like OCD, it's a systems problem when it happens, right? Like it doesn't just impact the individual, the whole family is impacted. Well, because think about it, like a lot of times what happens is the family, and this is important for any parents listening whose maybe children are struggling with something like this or could be, the family actually becomes the compulsion. So for instance, let's say someone has a fear of leaving the house. Well, if the family goes and accommodates and says, okay, you stay in the house, I'll go get your groceries, I'll make sure, all this stuff, it validates the fear. And now the family is now essentially responsible for this person's emotional state.
They're an enabler, right?
Yes,
they're enabling
yes.
it. That's with a lot of extremely obese people that you see that are like 500 pounds. Same thing. Like someone's giving them the food.
They couldn't do that without someone.
Yeah.
And we think that because we're making them feel better today, that we're helping them, but actually we always need to remember to prioritize someone's long-term well-being over their short-term feelings.
That's a great point.
That's great. Very well said. And this really is cool because when I was kind of researching the show, I came across, of course, like the medications. I mean, this is how like your typical doctor, psychiatrist is going to treat this. I'm really glad, because how do you feel about the medications? Do you feel like you recommend them with your formula, or you don't need them with your formula?
Yeah. So as a licensed clinical social worker, right, I don't have my medications not within my scope of practice, meaning I don't prescribe it. I can't speak on it. So what I say to people is this, like, you always make your own decision on that. Now, from a personal standpoint, I see this as a nervous system. Essentially, the nervous system's dysregulated. You're stuck in this fight or flight, and this fear energy is continuing to just perpetuate. And some studies came out, I think last year, and it was showing that, with SSRIs, which are kind of the primary intervention, right, that's often presented, things like Prozac, Zoloft, right, things like that. What's interesting is they, at least in the article that I read, and what I'll try to do is send you over the article, maybe link it if you want to.
Sure, we'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
But the study was finding that the SSRIs were effective on a placebo level, meaning that they like equal, right? They would give people SSRIs, and the placebo was one of the biggest indicators on their effectiveness. And I have never seen someone in my practice or when I work with people just take medication and actually achieve the results they're looking for. It's when someone really, again, removes the behaviors, right, through, what we would call exposure response prevention. And really why I promote the AAA response so much is because when we break that loop, the body innately knows how to heal, right? Like when you cut your finger, you can put whatever you want on it. The body is what heals itself. And the same thing with the nervous system. Your body wants to move to homeostasis, to normal, to balance. And if we really understand that the emotion is because we've stored it within our body and our job is to process it and release it, by doing the behaviors, we're keeping it in. And this is when you recontextualize it for someone, you begin to understand feeling anxiety is not bad. It needs to be felt to be released. And it's a different way of understanding it, because as long as we believe anxiety is a bad feeling or a disorder, the presence of anxiety, we're always going to do things to try to get rid of it and be resistant to it, paradoxically keeping us stuck in it.
Like attracting it, right?
Yeah.
Law of attraction.
I mean, just keeping the energetic loop going. It can become self-perpetuating eventually. It takes on a life of its own. And this is why when it comes to the meds, obviously, if someone uses them, I always recommend them as a secondary, something to assist in the primary intervention of behavior change and doing the work that I know to be the most effective.
Or like try the least toxic method first. What is that? They use that in going for the least toxic method of anything in your life. I think is just a good rule of thumb, right? Before you go run and get, because medication has side effects.
Well, yeah. And people have adverse effects, often like it's not uncommon, right? For someone that has OCD and anxiety to start taking this and the symptoms to intensify. So, again, I'm not advising one way or another on it. What I am simply saying is what I know, and even from a research standpoint, the most effective intervention is the behavioral altercation.
The behavior. Because even with the medication, and, obviously that's between you and your doctor, like you said, even with that, you're not actually removing the problem. Like a lot of medications for a lot of illnesses, you're treating a symptom. And so then you create a situation where you're going to be on this forever indefinitely. You don't have an end in sight.
Exactly. And this is why we always go cause, right? Causality. And you never go, because again, we live in California. I can't tell you how many young people that are taking their medical marijuana, right, to treat their anxiety. And that's just what they do. And now, especially with these concentrated oils and stuff where it's 80 to 90% THC and they're 16 and they're like, well, I have anxiety over my math test. What are we setting up for the rest of your life?
Yeah.
Like, I got to tell you, math tests are very small in the grand scheme of things you're going to have to encounter in life.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And then eventually when the weed or whatever they use stops working, that's generally when they move into something more powerful.
Yeah. We did a show on ADHD with a friend who got caught up in that and became very addicted to Adderall. And that was Adderall. Yeah. He became, the same thing in his case, he kept needing more because the feeling, that plateau kept rising. He had to keep taking more to get that feeling again. And to the point where he became like a raging addict, and had to have an intervention. And that took a while.
And this is what happens with compulsions, right? To some degree, we build tolerance to them, right? So what starts as a quick hand wash turns into, hey, I'm washing with a little more soap. Hey, I'm washing more intensely. Hey, I'm washing multiple times a day. Hey, I'm wearing gloves. It progresses because the fear just intensifies.
Mm-hmm. You're feeding it, right? You're feeding it, literally.
And you build a tolerance to it so it grows.
I'm curious, Matt, getting back to what you talked about before, you did an excellent job of talking about the cycle that someone goes through that has OCD and how they go through this loop in their mind. And I'm guessing it's a lot of different words. Is there a trigger word that you say is the root of most stress in people? Like, is there some sort of word out there that's a major trigger typically for people you work with?
Trigger word.
I wouldn't say. Wait, I'm going to clap. It's the should. I got it on your pitch for the holiday. Stress, should.
Oh, okay. Is like, what's at the root of most fear?
Look out for the word should. It's the root of most stress. The word implies.
Okay. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
I'm going to have an answer now.
Yeah. So really, like when it comes to fear and anxiety, again, because it's generally founded in beliefs to begin with, what really causes people most resistance to things, whether it's feelings or thoughts or experiences, is this underlying idea that something should be different than how it is, right? So that's really a lot of what I talk with my clients about, is not looking out for the word should in their life. So for instance, let's just say I go outside and it's raining and I'm like, well, it should be sunny right now. Well, now I'm in conflict with the fact that it's raining. And now it's raining. I think raining is causing me to be upset, when it's really my belief that it shouldn't be raining.
Okay.
Oh, God, don't we do that? We do that as humans, like constantly, right?
Right. Well, because we're fighting with reality. So when I think, hey, I shouldn't feel anxiety, it's actually my belief that I shouldn't feel it. That is the problem. And that's what causes me to resist it and then causes me to do behaviors that perpetuate it. And so the idea that we know how things should be is oftentimes the major root of most of our conflict in life, to be honest.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I think that's very true. And there's that saying, if you're living in the future, you're in worry. If you're living in the past, you're in regret. So really the only place you really are trying to get to and should be is the present moment, because that's all you really have.
Well, it's the only thing that's real. And this is really from a nervous system standpoint. I think we talked about it a bit, but one of the things that I like to teach people is really seeing the nervous system like an internal stoplight, right? So you have, when you're in green, you feel safe being here. You feel safe conversing, talking to people. So most of the energy is actually in your face. It's up here because you're socializing. When you feel fight or flight, you're actually going to feel most of the energy in your chest, because that's where it's activating to pump blood and all that stuff. And then red is down in your stomach where you literally freeze. That's the immobilization. So if you think green, yellow, red, right, from a nervous system standpoint, what's happening with people is they're really getting stuck in yellow. And by doing this work of challenging the fears and releasing a lot of the fear, you move back into green, and then you feel safe being like right here, right now.
Right. Yeah, that's a good technique. And speaking of techniques, can you kind of explain a little what you have coined the AAA response as a method?
One of the challenging things that I had in my own journey, which was a long journey for me, but part of what, because I didn't even know what I was experiencing,
Well, Matt, you look very young. How long was the journey?
I mean, given that it was about 18, when it really kicked off in a really bad way, I mean, I'd say it was a good 10 years, from where I felt like I was really in a state of recovery, where I really developed a certain level of, I know what to do with myself. You know what I mean? And then feeling safe, being present, all that. Now, there was definitely this like uphill trajectory, right? So things got better and better and better and better, but it really was, a good 4 years of me being stuck in the loop without anyone ever telling me.
I was going to say, did family and friends notice it? Were they like, hey?
They definitely knew. And even I was going to like therapists and trying to get help, but no one ever told. It was funny. How I got the official like diagnosis is I went to Mariners Church.
Oh, that's where we go. Do you go to Mariners?
And I was going to Rock Harbor at the time, but then Mariners, they had a college group there. But I was going and I would have people pray over me, right, for help because I was just suffering, and I didn't know what was wrong. And this woman, I swear some kind of divine intervention, looked at me and was like, hey, I think you have OCD. And my conception of OCD was the hand washing. And I'm like, well, I don't wash my hands. That like 4-year period before then, it was just me being stuck. And then that was really a turning point on the journey. I actually like give a shout out to her in the book, just because I was like, I hope I see her again one day. Because I was like, I don't know who
that's amazing.
But maybe she's an angel, right?
I know.
I'm going to look for her next time I go to Mariner.
Something like that. Yeah, it definitely happened.
So you had gone to therapists, a psychiatrist?
No one had ever diagnosed me. They're like, I think you're just anxious, and this, and no one ever gave me any, again, what did they throw? They threw meds at me, right? You know what I mean? Like that was the primary solution that was presented. Or things like don't worry, which is not helpful.
Don't worry. You've got a worrying problem. Don't worry.
Yeah. It always is good. It's like telling someone who wrestles with alcoholism, like, don't drink, It's like, oh, okay, yeah. Thanks, dude. Like they haven't thought of that. But anyways.
Oh, you're a AAA response method.
Yeah. So AAA. So because the solution was to break the loop, right? Which in breaking the loop meant not engaging in any behaviors. The thing that gets most people caught is doing the mental behaviors, the ruminating, the mental worrying, the mental analyzing, all of that. I'd say that's probably most of people's like 80% of their behaviors. So the thing that keeps people stuck is all the stuff they do in their mind. So the AAA response was kind of a process that I started to like, and again, I didn't call it this at the time. It was like, what do I need to do to make sure I don't do any behaviors that keep this loop going? It's like, instead of like, don't do these behaviors, it's like, what can we implement to make sure that doesn't happen? So the process is from a thought, a feeling, and behavior standpoint. And so the first day is to agree and disengage the mind. So the first part is, and even then is understanding this idea of consciousness, like we talked about earlier. You have to do this from a higher state of consciousness than the mind. You have to be the observer of the mind before you could even do this. So this is where things like meditation, being able to diffuse from the mind is just a skill set to learn. So the first is the agree and disengage and like, okay, yeah, whatever, and disengage the mind, finding the energy in the body and actually releasing your resistance and actually allowing it, and then attack. So like you're familiar with Hawkins' maps of consciousness, anger is actually higher than a state of fear when it comes to energy or aggression. So by moving into a more aggressive state and inviting the energy to come up, inviting the experience you don't want to happen, that actually you're able to feel fear from a level of anger, if you will, right? So you can move up into a higher energy to address the fear. And then doing the opposite of whatever the fear is telling you to do. So by doing those steps consistently, you can essentially make sure you're not engaging in any behaviors that are going to perpetuate the loop. So that's what the AAA response, the whole philosophy is. We want to implement a solution that someone becomes so good at doing that they eventually do it unconsciously. Like I want them to just do this without even thinking about it. So we know on a 24/7 level, they're not engaging in compulsions that are going to make the loop worse.
Right. So say we have an example of an extreme hand washer, because we keep bringing that one up, and they come to see you and they're like the type that's, getting their hands raw. I'm sure I know everybody's different, but what would be an average of like coming from like a real extreme example of getting healed with this process?
Yeah. And so that's a really good question. So I always have like 2 goals for my clients or anyone that comes to the program. It's number 1, we want to get you to the point where you're subclinical, meaning you're taking the assessment and you score in a way that you can't get a diagnosis. So like that's always goal 1 is subclinical. And so they have the Yale Brown Obsessive-compulsive scale, and we want to get the person to below where like someone who didn't have it would test.
Okay. There's a free quiz. Do you have that on your website?
If you typed in the Y box to Google, it would pull it. It's an assessment for OCD and anxiety. So is what they're using to assess. And what they're measuring, though, is most of the behaviors that people are engaging in. So when we really treat it from a behavioral standpoint, we can see a significant reduction in behaviors, which will drop the score. So the first thing is to get someone subclinical. The second thing is to get them to the point where they have a conversation that says, hey, Matt, it was cool knowing you, but I never want to talk to you again. Because we want someone to feel so equipped with the skills that they're their own therapist. They're their own healer.
And they can use that.
Yes, exactly.
And if it comes up, if it rears its ugly head in a different way, right?
Yeah, sure. And I never want someone to feel like they're reliant on me or anyone for that matter, because I might not be there one day. You know what I mean? It's not a justice to the person. Those are always pretty much my second and primary goals for people, is to get them back in their life.
Do you think like in the traditional like Western medicine, do you see this happen where they treated somebody and the person got rid of, say, their hand washing, and then it did rear itself as a different thing?
Oh, absolutely. Well, because again, if you don't address the fear and you address the symptom, right? Like the thing they're projecting on, that just latches onto something else. And I've seen people totally bounce from intensive about different thing to different thing. And they're there's a word in like the therapeutic practice called lifers. They're just like people who say things like that, where they're like, oh, they're a lifer. They're just, I don't obviously believe that. I don't think they need to be. But, and like we said, this is a spectrum of an experience. But I mean, I have seen very radical transformation happen, because what matters is not sure, they need to learn the right thing. They need to go through the right education. They need to put the right tools in place. All that needs to happen. But what really determines someone's success, in my opinion, and this is always kind of what I'm looking for when someone applies for the program, is this person someone who takes responsibility for their health? Like, is this someone that says like, hey, I need to get myself better? Or are they saying, hey, you need to save me? Because if it's a you need to save me, it's tough, because then I'm supposed to do the work for you.
Yeah. They want the quick fix.
Yeah. And so the responsibility is a big thing, but then also their motivation to get better. And so a lot of what we start with is like, what's going on in your life that you're really ready for change? And because the average time between someone onsetting, right, with these symptoms, like you said in the beginning of the episode, Ron, 10 years old, 19 years old is kind of average onset. The average time before someone gets help is usually 7 years.
Yeah, I read something like that. I was just shocked.
And in Australia, I just learned it's actually like 17 years, because we have people from Australia.
Because they don't realize it's an actual issue.
Again, think about it. So let's say someone has scrupulosity, which is when OCD becomes religious, right? Which is like a form I had, right? Where they get afraid of, let's say, what if I get sent to hell?
Oh, I see. Okay.
What if I committed the unforgivable sin? Did God really forgive me?
Sad.
But so where do they go? They're going to go to churches. They're going to go and say, hey, I need to do more work at church. I need to pray. They're not going to think OCD. I wasn't thinking OCD. You're going to think the problem is whatever the fear is latched onto.
Very interesting.
So a lot of people are coming to like Catholic Mass and confessing as a compulsion. The priest is actually offering reassurance and making them worse, thinking that this is a scrupulosity.
Give us some crazy OCD, or really maybe common ones that you see a lot, that anyone listening who might have a child or themselves that might connect dots, because I wouldn't have even thought about that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really common one, actually, right? Scrupulosity. I mean, I get a lot of people, and I mean, obviously, I experienced it, right? One of my fears was like, what if I get possessed?
Oh, wow.
I remember that. And it was like, I saw some movie about it, and I was like, well, what if that happened to me?
Oh, some of these movies do a lot of damage.
And it was like, I didn't even think I saw a movie. I saw like a preview, right? And it's like, but again, when
that was the wrong commercial to watch, Matt.
Right. But when you're filled with fear and you have so much carried on, again, it can latch on to anything. So when you'll hear people say this, almost every story in every case I've ever worked, the person can tell me the day that this started. It's like, I read some post online. Someone said something to me in a conversation. I heard about mold in biology class, and it just spiraled. So when it comes to like common themes, a big portion of them are, like I said, the intrusive thoughts. And the intrusive thoughts generally fall into three main categories, right? It's usually related to harm, sex, and religion. And it's generally like, what if I became a serial killer? What if I snapped and like drove my car off a bridge when I was driving? What if, like, so these kind of thoughts are like, what if, because and it will all happen because they'll read a story about a mom that hurts her children or something like that. And it's like, what if that happened to me? What if I became a pedophile one day? And it's always usually like categories of people that do things that would essentially get ostracized from society. What if I grabbed a policeman's gun when he was standing next to me? And again, you're going to find that the common traits, people would never act on these things. They are not congruent with who they are. There's this fear, right? Of like, what if that happened? And then, like I said, with God and religion, and I've seen it in most religions you can imagine. I've even seen like atheists. It's a thing where someone might even not logically believe in it, but get caught in it. You kind of have those intrusive thought categories. And then you have the contamination is big, but it's not just germs. It can be, again, environmental contamination, right? It can be emotional contamination, right? It can be like, well, like I remember I had one case where the person had a panic attack in their house and they didn't want to go into the house anymore because of the energy of panic was still there. Or like someone didn't want to drive on a street because that street reminded of something. And then there's obviously like perfectionism.
I was going to say, so are a lot of perfectionists more susceptible?
Well, again, see, and this is like, I guess I would reframe the whole statement because not to correct, it's more perfectionism is the behavior that is at the end of the cycle. So the thought is usually, well, what if I get fired if this email is not perfect? So out of fear, they compulsively review and review and review and review the email to protect them from getting fired.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Oh, I see.
So perfectionism is what we see on the outside, but it's that fear energy underneath that we're always looking for underneath.
I did not know this.
I mean, I'm just trying to go off the top of my head here, but hit and run and driving obviously are huge. So someone will have like the fear of, what if I hit someone when I was driving and I don't remember, right? And so they'll like drive back and check. And then I remember totally having someone, I was looking down the window and the person was supposed to meet me in the office and they just kept looping the building because every time they came around, it was like they had that thought, well, what if I ran into someone over that time? And then they just kept looping and looping and looping. And
that's debilitating.
Oh, yeah. It can really get to the point where it's very debilitating.
Yeah. Like it's ruling you.
Oh,
seems like it takes over your life so much, right? It's making the decisions. It's not you. It's this energy, like this fear energy, like you said.
Hey, man, it sounds like part of your AAA response, where you're going back initially, you talked about in the first part where you have to be the conscious observer. It's what your thoughts are, right?
Yeah.
I know one thing, I'm not saying that I had any of this, but we all have different degrees of anxiety, right? So one thing that always taught me was that whole thought process about we are not our thoughts. So like anytime I have thoughts I don't like, I'm like, okay, I'm not my thoughts. I'm just the observer of my thoughts.
Sure.
It always, for me internally, seems to correct my course of what I want to do for that.
Yeah.
Time.
Get you out of negative.
Even just noticing that, right? Because so many people, again, they're caught in that illusion, that paradigm, right? I thought this, that's what I think, as opposed to the thought is something that as they experience. And I mean, I think like, probably the most transformational works, or at least the people that introduced me to these concepts, would have been Eckhart Tolle in The Power of Now, and then also Michael Singer in The Untethered Soul. Like two phenomenal works. And that whole concept was a huge part of my own recovery and even becoming introduced to that idea. And that's where, what I always aim to do is to try to incorporate a lot of different aspects of different philosophies into this, because it's like, I think one of the problems is that we get trained, whether it's, okay, if you go into the medical route of become a medical doctor, you get trained from a biological perspective, where it's like energy healers are on the other side where they're only energy. And then it's like, then you have therapists that are like, I just know CBT or I just know psychoanalysis. One of the great things about the time that we live in is we have access to so much stuff. And I think getting one track mind and like my profession or my thing is the only way to go about things. You lose access to so many things that you can supplement your processes with, right? And that's why, obviously, I've ran residential treatments. I should say I've worked in residential treatments and intensive treatments, right? Where we're doing a very intense therapeutic process intervention in a very short period of time. But one of the things is that I just have this fundamental connection to, again, a more spiritual aspect of things, as well as belief in incorporating aspects of energy healing, aspects of, like things to do with the body. And I try not to get so one track minded on things and letting go of the ego of like, well, my way is right.
Yeah. Different things will work and resonate with different people too.
And that's why consciousness is such a cornerstone of a lot of the stuff that we do.
Yeah, so important. You don't hear people talk about that with OCD. It's definitely, this conversation has like so expanded my mind. I had an OCD perception that was just doing a task repeatedly. I didn't know it was so much in the head. And I didn't realize those thoughts could be so debilitating. And like you said, how many people do we know that are suffering from that, but we don't know?
Well, yeah, because what most people, right, they suffer in silence for fear of shame of even telling you what's going on in their mind. You know what I mean? Like that's oftentimes the biggest relief that I see someone have is when they sit there and tell me what's going on. I'm like, oh yeah, that's totally normal. Right. In the context of this.
You've been through it.
In the context of this, because their fear is, why do I keep having this thought pop up of like, what if I become a serial killer? I love people. I don't want to hurt people. And it's like they see something online, like of something happen, and the fear just catches it. And this is where we started seeing cases of like COVID OCD. Like the OCD just latched on to COVID, as you can imagine. But that wasn't a thing prior to 2020. And that's because the fear can really latch on to anything. And when you understand that, if you don't work at it from a fear perspective, you're going to create a situation where the person might get better around a theme and then latch on to something else. And this is why I don't agree with that model and very much like to work at it from that energy perspective of really releasing the fear at its deepest level.
Yeah. So for people listening, because I know this current younger generation is really stressed, right? I mean, I get press releases and read so much that they have a lot of pressure. More so, we've got technology, we have social media pressure, a lot of worldly events. They've got a really tough time. So for anybody listening who's got kids that are struggling with whatever, that could be symptoms. What are some signs and symptoms that parents could look out for that their kid might be OCD? Yeah, or severe.
Yeah, OCD and anxiety. Isolation would be the first thing that I would you'll see, because again, and it's just a nervous system thing, right? Like people tend to disconnect when they aren't in green. So isolation is always one of the first big things you want to start to pay attention to, where it's like, for some reason, they're not coming to dinner. Or, it's like, I feel like I haven't seen them in a while. You know what I mean? They're not hanging out. They're going in their room a lot and being by themselves. Isolation is definitely something that you'd want to pay attention to. Generally, when someone's doing something and they're in the energy of fear, you can sense that. So paying attention to kind of like the energy that your child's operating from. So for instance, if they're studying and they're studying in this real anxious, fearful state and like getting stressed out about it, understanding it's not studying that's making them stressed, right? It's this underlying fear of like, what if I fail? What if I get a bad grade? All this stuff that's going to cause them to bring that energy into what they're doing. You see, so a lot of it is going to start in this what if fearful thinking. And from a parent standpoint, again, and this is where I've actually changed my perspective on this as of recent. You guys talk about, right, healthy homes, right? And that's the central message. What we have to realize as a collective, as a society, is that, especially in America, we don't prioritize health. And what I mean by that is when you look at the industries that are at the top of the game, you're going to see escapism and distraction. So for instance, if you see alcohol, the reason people drink alcohol is to escape their feelings. Right? It's plain and simple. They don't like how they feel. And then tobacco, right? Same thing. Entertainment, sports. And this is why social media is not the cause of stress and anxiety. It's that it's used so much as a distraction from the emotion that the emotions, I believe, are just storing up. And this is why what most people do with their emotions is, again, suppress or repress or escape, right? And this is why the industries that offer escape, I think, are so explosive. And because it gives people this opportunity to not be with themselves. Like the worst thing for most people would be, hey, go stay 4 hours in a room without your phone or anything. Like most people, that would cause them to freak out. You know what I mean? And because it's like we're so used to this distraction. And then all of a sudden, when you don't, though, this is why, like, I don't know if you guys saw like Aaron Rodgers going on that darkness retreat. The brilliance of a darkness retreat, or like the 10-day silent retreats that are offered, is all it does is take away your distractions and everything naturally comes up.
When you say darkness, meaning like actual dark or no
Yeah,
technology?
like put in the dark,
Oh,
like
he
in
did?
like a
Realize
dark
that.
room. Yeah,
For 10
like
days?
no,
That
not for.
sounds
I don't
horrible.
think his is for 10 days, but there's like 10-day silent meditations where you can't talk for 10 days. I don't know how long the darkness retreats are.
And he also did that herbal treatment too. What is it called? Didn't I heard something about this? Did you take that herbal? What's that herbal?
I don't know about that one, to be honest.
Well, I think it was almost like a natural trip he went on too, right?
I don't think I'd like a dark retreat. I like the silent retreat. That would be cool.
Well, and most people talk about how intense like 10-day silent retreat really is because we're talking and interacting is one way that, like you have to confront everything. And with darkness, you take away your ability to see, you're just fully in here at that point. And that's why I've never done either of those. Like I understand the philosophy of it, of having actually like the stuff we need to confront is already here. A lot of work on yourself is not about changing outside of you. If you think the problem's outside of you, you're always going to try to change something outside of you and correct your environment. And it's not going to be fruitful because you're always going to be there.
Right.
It's the same thing. Like when someone's like, well, yeah, you just bounce from relationship to relationship to relationship. It's like, what's the common thread here?
Right. Exactly. When you start to see patterns, I always say that if there's patterns, then you've got to start looking at yourself, right?
So with kids, with parents, it's like, yeah, patterns of isolation, patterns of repetitive behavior that this just doesn't make sense. Why are you washing your hands right when you wake up in the morning? You know what I mean? And a lot of times, to be transparent, you can just see it on someone's face. Like if we step out of everything, I can spot someone in mental distress really well because obviously I know it personally, but it's like, you can usually just see it in the face. They don't have like the energy's not here, right? It's in here. And our ability to not just take what people are saying and actually pay attention to nonverbal communication and just body language and just facial expression, like that's most of people's communication. So it's kind of a lost skill because most of us, again, are locked into our phones.
Like even a digital detox, we were talking about, you don't have to go dark, but a digital detox is a really good thing.
And again, I'm not like promoting either of those things. It's more like I just understanding the philosophy of like, when you want to confront your stuff, it's here to confront. It's not like there's so many people that talk about like these extravagant treatment ideology. It's really not. I mean, for the most of us, like we can do the work throughout our day. In fact, a trigger is just that. It's you're having an over emotional response to an event. And the reason that's happening is because your emotion within is coming up.
Yeah, really powerful.
Man, you've been a wealth of information.
I know. Yeah. Hopefully we're not talking too long.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. I think you've ever been intrigued.
Well, I had one last question. Well, if this goes untreated, someone doesn't recognize it or have help and never gets to the root, can it lead to suicidal tendencies? Like, do you find a lot of these people get depressed?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd say the primary, and this is oftentimes what you're first going to be presenting with, right? Because like I said, the person's not going to come to you and say, I have OCD, unless they do all their own Google research and they find that out. And that's kind of why a lot of my work exists, is to really help just bring awareness to what's going on. So that's always cool to me when someone's like, oh, I found that video you put in it made sense because that's what I was experiencing. And they find it within, let's say, a month of first onset. It's like, well, to cut that 7 years down, that 7-year average is great. So absolutely, what tends to happen with OCD and anxiety is the secondary symptom is depression. But like I said, when you go to your doctor and you tell them you're feeling depressed, if the primary cause is the OCD and anxiety, treating the depression isn't really going to be effective. Because we're not, like, essentially your body's moving into that immobilization to really get you out of the fight or flight. So the paradox of the treatment is we have to go and actually confront the OCD and anxiety, and the secondary symptoms of depression almost always alleviate on their own.
Wow.
Well, because they're secondary. It makes sense when you think if you have an infection in your arm and you get a headache, if you treat the infection, the headache goes away. It's the same kind of thing here and that's why you always need to understand what's primary, what's secondary.
Right. I'm wondering, there's got to be a big percentage of the population being misdiagnosed for just depression when these root things are driving that.
Yeah. And this is why it's not that they don't have depression. It's just that that's not primary. That's not primary. Yeah, that's a huge thing. Because obviously I was in an extreme state of depression. And absolutely, like with depression becomes the total normal, to have the thoughts of not wanting to live. Because ultimately, in that state, one of the hard things about the loop itself and dealing with something like this is if you don't know what you're experiencing and you don't have a hopeful path ahead, and you're just like, am I just going to live like this forever? It's easy to lose hope for your future, right? And I think that's why we work hard on trying to get the messages to people is something you can't overcome. But it really, you're saying though, it's also something you can't ignore. You can't just put this aside and say, you know what, I'm just going to become a workaholic and do Adderall and take, Ambien to sleep and just medicate and escape, because eventually when that stuff all comes crashing down, you're still going to have to deal with this. And this is why I think, like we were talking about as a society, when we don't prioritize health and we prioritize, let's say, productivity or output or who can grind harder or a lot of the messages that seem to be pretty central, we justify doing unhealthy behaviors today, and that leads to long-term issues. When people realize that mental health truly is a practice, just like physical health. And the reason mental health is so common is because we have terrible common mental health practices that we all engage in.
It's so taboo. I mean, you think of mental health and you think of like someone in a mental health institution. Or,
someone that's
it
in
has
a
such a taboo, negative.
Or the person
straitjacket.
Screaming at breakfast on the street, right?
Right.
But again, we all have mental health. And so when you start realizing that your state of your mental health is a result of the practice you're engaging in, much like your physical health. We have physical practices that lead to physical health, good or bad.
Yeah, we don't talk about mental health. You're right. It's really not discussed.
But then when you understand that whatever your state is simply a result of practices you've been engaging in, when you start changing your practice, you begin to understand that you can change your state over time.
So cool. I love it. This was amazing. We could talk to you for 2 more hours at least.
Right, yeah, this is fun.
We're like light bulbs. Well, guys, and if you're listening, there is always hope. Okay. No matter what you're going through, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. And just know that, as I say, there's always a way out, right? Like in the movie, when the guy's like in this building and there's no windows and doors, and then somehow the helicopter comes through, right?
Yeah.
There's always a way. There's always a way out.
And I think the central message, if I may share more personal, is like when you set your sights and intentions on recovery, like there are forces beyond you that will help you. Like that woman at the church.
Powerful. I got goosebumps when you said that.
No. I mean, when you decide that you're going to recover and you're going to get better, like it's not just you on this journey. I fully believe that there are interventions that happen that are beyond our perception and for the good. And like that woman that talked to me that day changed the trajectory of my life.
Wow. Powerful.
And you've never seen her since, Matt. You've not spotted her again.
Couldn't even tell you what she looks like.
Okay.
I was an angel.
Because of the state I was in. But I think that's the point is like, and this is a thing that I think everyone should understand is one conversation with someone can change the course of their life.
Oh, yeah.
And realizing the power of that.
Smiling at a stranger. Someone who's having a horrible day. Yeah, just the smile. Yeah, let this be a reminder to be kind, like practice more kindness. I think the world could use a lot more of that.
But there's always a solution now.
Always a solution. Thank you, Matt. Thank you for being with us today. Guys, you can learn more about Matt's incredible work at restoredminds.com, where you can join his program or work with Matt one-on-one. And don't forget to check out his new book, From Stuck to Unstuck, on Amazon.
And thanks for being with us today, friends. We'll have all the links in the show notes at ronalisa.com/podcast. Join us in 2 weeks for another episode and get ready to up-level your health. Bye. Take care.
This episode of the Healthy Home Hacks podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more healthy living strategies and tactics to help you create the healthy home you've always dreamed of. And don't forget to rate and review so we can continue to bring you the best content. See you on the next episode.